Us now, senior national correspondent at The Bulwark, based in Michigan, Jonathan Cohn, MS Now political analyst, Democratic strategist, and former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party, Basil Smikle, CEO and executive editor at Lincoln Square, Susan Demas. She is also covering Michigan and has covered Michigan politics for some 20 years. And New York Times chief White House correspondent and MS Now contributor, Peter Baker, an all-star panel with us. Peter, is this a preview of what Trump plans for his attacks moving into the midterms? I mean, he's going into his typical playbook of rigged election.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. Any election that doesn't go the way he thinks it should go, he's very likely to call rigged. Doesn't matter that there are any facts there. Nobody's presented any facts about this election being rigged. And he doesn't wait for any facts. He doesn't wait for an investigation if there was anything to investigate. So, yeah, everybody should take what he says with a grain of salt, given that he continues to believe or continue to assert that the 2020 election was rigged when all indications are, of course, that it wasn't. His own people told him it wasn't. And so you'll hear a lot of that. You're going to hear a lot about communists. You're going to hear a lot about that going into the fall. That's clearly the strategy he has. He's going to try to wrap Saeed not just around the Democrats in Michigan, but again around the necks of every Democrat running in every district around the country, no matter how moderate or leftist they might be. And that's a strategy that he has because he doesn't have a lot of other strategies at this point that look promising. He's not doing well on affordability, according to polls. The public does not like the Iran war, according to polls. And so scaring voters about the alternative is a tried and true practice in politics. And you're going to hear him talk a lot about that.
Does that strategy work? I mean, it seems like communism is the new Marsha. It's communism. Peter, does that seem like it's a strategic move by this White House? And, we're going to start seeing that a lot more from Republicans writ large.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this before. He tried this in 2018 during the midterm elections when he was down and out, and it didn't actually stop the Democrats from taking over the House that year. He tried it again in the off-year elections last year in New Jersey with Mikey Sherrill and Virginia with Abigail Spanberger, neither one of whom had any trouble winning their races anyway, because even though that he tried to make them to be clones of Mamdani, their voters didn't see them that way. So there are limits to how far this works in races where you have candidates that people know and trust and have a strong opinion about already, who can't be painted in ways that they aren't necessarily. But that doesn't mean it won't be an effective rallying cry in other districts. And the Democrats have nominated more people this year, I think, that play into that, people who are openly socialists and therefore will give him some ammunition to work with. But I think that the polls have all suggested that the biggest issue of the year is people's feelings about the economy and how they can't afford the lifestyle they want to be able to afford in terms of groceries and fuel and all that. And that's why he's out in Las Vegas today to try to address those.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly, for Mike Rogers, Jonathan, this win by El Sayed is seen as a gift. You've been paying very close attention to Michigan, but does it help Mike Rogers when you have the president comparing part of his state, a very crucial part of his state, to the third world?
Well, I don't think it does. And I think more important, I think what Peter was just was saying is so important, which is that, they're attacking him as communist or socialist or whatever label they're going to throw at him. Because on the actual issues that El Sayed's going to try to raise, they're in trouble. Abdul El Sayed, he's going to talk about healthcare. He's going to say, I'm a doctor. I was public health director. I got people healthcare. And look, these Republicans, Mike Rogers, they took away your health care. They've cut the Obamacare subsidies. Mike Rogers is tied to the pharmaceutical industry. He voted, took votes that kept prescription drug prices higher. He's going to talk about data centers. He's going to say, look, everyone in Michigan, it's a big issue here this year. People don't like these data centers. And they're going to say, Mike Rogers, he supports these data centers. I'm here to block them. And issue by issue, if you can get past the labels on the actual issues, the Democrats in general, El Sayed in particular, he's on the right side of those issues. So the question is, can he break through? Can he get through to the voters, or does this onslaught of Republican attacks make it impossible to get across that message?
Boy, you teed that up as if you knew. Susan, national Republicans are already attacking El Sayed with some new ads. Let's listen to one.
Abdul-Rahman Mohammed El Sayed, the most radical Senate candidate in America.
Pretty dangerous.
El Sayed pledged support for the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, a designated foreign terrorist group. He wants to hike taxes on Michigan waitresses, delivery drivers, and seniors on Social Security. He joined a sex offender and a murderer to demand the mass release of dangerous prisoners.
There's also the ad percolating about how he says himself, I'm dangerous if ... It's much of it taken out of context, but, it's a pretty glossy ad already. Are these types of ads, these types of messages going to play out with the great middle, the independent voters in Michigan?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. As ugly as this primary was, and it was ugly, that is going to be child's play compared to this general election. I mean, this is just the warm-up act for Republicans. They're calling him a communist, a terrorist, and we're going to have to see how El-Sayed is able to respond to this and how he's able to bridge divides within the party, because this was not the result he was expecting. A lot of his supporters thought it would be a double-digit win, and he has to mend a lot of fences right now.
So to that end, Basil, if you were running El-Sayed's campaign, what would your advice be to counter or get ahead even of some of these attack ads are already out there and are coming?
Well, the first thing is the assumption that a ton of money is going to get flooded into that state because it's a swing state. It's a very important state. And the Republicans know that Democrats don't have a clear path to Senate, to taking back the Senate without Michigan. So you, number one, expect a ton of money and a ton of ads. Two, I think he started this path last night with the way that he was going to attack Rogers as his opponent by talking a lot of what Peter and others have talked about already. So I think he's on the right side of the issues. The key here is, can he stitch together an appropriate coalition? I think a big sort of connector between this primary coalition and the general election coalition is organized labor. It's very important.
Yeah, I actually want to touch on the coalition, or even maybe lack thereof. El-Sayed won by less than 1%. I know the polls had him ahead way more than that. That's a totally different topic. But it's not exactly the soaring progressive success that I think they were expecting his camp. Politico points out, and I think this is important, that this race was yet another sign that the insurgent left, like Maine, performed best among wealthier, highly educated voters, while moderate Democrats still perform better in lower income and less educated areas. Yeah. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, and this is specific to black voters, is really important here, that for 100 plus years, African American voters have had this sort of inside-outside game. They understand being progressive and running against the institutions, but they also know very well the importance of trying to reform institutions from within. And in many ways, they see a lot of progressive candidates, whether they consider themselves DSA or not, as being so anti-institution that there's no room for them as voters to see themselves being able to make political and economic gains through their mobilization.
Do they see themselves reflected in the progressive agenda?
Not as much as they need to be able to have this coalition kind of carry forward into the general election. That's what we saw in New York, and the question was, does New York translate to any place else? We're seeing now with this very high-profile race, a statewide race, that the closeness of the victory says there is no definitive narrative about a moderate or progressive victory. It says that a lot of work still needs to be done to stitch together this coalition.
Is it possible?
Very possible, particularly on the issues and the fact that Democrats have been overperforming across the country. And we see this even in the congressional races because one of my friends, Emanuel Cleaver, who won his primary in Missouri, because of the redistricting of his district, now has to run in Republican rural areas in that state. He may lose, and that means we're going to lose black seats that we haven't seen the numbers of which since pre-Voting Rights Act of 1965. There's a lot at stake. Black voters know that. So that coalition needs to come together quickly. Yeah,
Susan, I want to touch a little bit on the flood of money that's going to be pouring into the state you've covered for so long. Clearly, El-Sayed had touted how much money was being spent against him by the Haley Stevens supporters, and yet he still won, and by a very, very minimal margin, but he still won. It's assumed Mike Rogers is going to have a lot more money even than El-Sayed. He says he doesn't take corporate dollars. You know, how successful can he be when he's up against a behemoth of money?
That is an excellent question. And for as much as El Sayed has railed against AIPAC in the primary, they're not going anywhere. They're going to be spending heavily for Mike Rogers. So will corporate interest. He has Donald Trump's endorsement and access to his donors. So there's going to be much more money in this general because the Senate goes directly through Michigan. The majority goes through Michigan, and everyone is going to play here. And so I do think that El Sayed has a powerful message because a lot of people are very sick of corporate money infecting our politics. But at the end of the day, corporate money can do a lot to get a candidate across the finish line.
And in accordance with the law of the land as it stands right now. Jonathan, let's look outside of the borders of Michigan, where we saw moderate Democrats dominating in their primaries against progressives. That happened in Missouri. It happened in Washington. What's the takeaway there?
I think one takeaway is that there is still a lot of local state issues that matter. I mean, part of the story in Michigan is a Michigan story about how, and the individuals involved here, right, of El Sayed versus Haley Stevens. And if you kind of go down race by race, you see different wrinkles. We saw once again the power of people with national security credentials being powerful. I do think there is a general sentiment across the country among Democrats, including here in Michigan, and why it was close. One of the reasons it was close. Democrats want to win. They understand the stakes. They don't all agree on how you get there and what kind of candidate is the best. And sometimes you have three-way races or two-way races, or someone's got a particular history. But I do think Democrats in general want to win. The hard part is there's a lot of not just frustration with the Democratic establishment, but also a lot of distrust of the Democratic establishment. So when you get these establishment figures or leaders or endorsements who say you need to sort of side with a certain person, Democratic voters don't necessarily trust that judgment, even if it might be right or wrong.